Little Phenol was one of those villages that seemed to exist outside the hurry of the modern world, as if the very clockwork of time had been slowed to suit the comfort of its inhabitants. Hedgerows lined every winding lane, dotted with early spring blossoms that were stubbornly persistent despite the chill that still lingered in the mornings. Smoke from stone chimneys coiled lazily into the sky, carrying with it the faint scent of peat and freshly baked bread from the baker's shop on the high street. The village green, which served as the heart of communal life, was currently deserted save for a lone robin hopping between tufts of grass and a small scattering of daffodils nodding in the gentle breeze. It was on the surface a picture of idyllic tranquility, but Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favorite wicker chair by the window of her modest cottage on St. Mary's Lane, knew better than to trust appearances. From the rustle of voices at the vicarage to the faint tension in the postwoman's step, the little threads of unease in Little Phenol were as tangible to her as the warmth of her knitted shawl. Miss Marple, for all her kindly, elderly appearance, possessed a mind finely tuned to human eccentricities and half-hidden truths. She had always said that villages, like gardens, had their weeds, and though the flowers might be bright and fragrant, the weeds could choke them if ignored. Her eyes, sharp beneath a fringe of snowy hair, scanned the street outside as though she were quietly rehearsing a mental catalog of every inhabitant's habits and peculiarities. It was the week leading up to the village's spring fair, and already Miss Marple could sense the currents of rivalry, gossip, and quiet envy that invariably surfaced whenever the villagers were gathered for such an occasion. There was, she thought, more to the impending festival than a mere display of embroidered tablecloths and home-baked pies. People revealed their hearts in these gatherings, sometimes unwittingly, sometimes with careful calculation. The source of Miss Marple's current preoccupation, however, was not the fair, but the sudden, almost imperceptible change in the demeanor of Mrs. Prudence Hargrove, the choir mistress of St. Mary's Church. Prudence Hargrove had been a figure of some repute in Little Phenol for nearly 20 years, a woman whose soprano voice had once drawn parishioners from neighboring villages to Sunday services, and who had been credited with transforming the modest church choir into a source of genuine pride. But in the last fortnight, Prudence had ceased to sing entirely. Not a note had passed her lips, not even a whispered hymn during the early morning practice sessions. She attended rehearsals and directed the choir with her accustomed precision, but her lips remained tightly sealed, and her once bright eyes carried a shadow of something unspoken. It was on a Tuesday morning that Miss Marple first noticed the tension escalate to something more urgent. She had been walking to the post office, a basket tucked under her arm and a scarf around her neck, when she saw a small group of villagers gathered outside the church porch. Voices were hushed, but the expressions were unmistakable, concern tinged with curiosity. Among the small crowd stood Reverend Benedict Hawthorne, whose neat clerical collar was unusually crooked, and Miss Eliza Thorne, the vicarage housekeeper, whose face was as lined with worry as it usually was with the sharp satisfaction of a job well done. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll want to know," Miss Thorne began, her voice quivering despite her usual firmness. "It's Prudence Hargrove. She won't speak to anyone properly. And, well, she had a fall yesterday." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted delicately. "A fall, you say? Nothing serious, I hope." Miss Thorne shook her head. "She's fine physically, no broken bones. But it was odd, you see. She tripped in the vestry and just collapsed. The strange thing is, she didn't make a sound, not a cry, not a word. And afterwards she hasn't sung a single note, not even at practice this morning." And Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already sifting through the subtle possibilities. "Is there something troubling you?" Prudence shook her head, and the motion was slight, almost imperceptible. "I cannot explain," she whispered, and then, remarkably, she turned away, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The room was heavy with silence. Her mind was already at work. Prudence Hargrove's sudden silence was not merely an accident. It was a symptom of something deeper. Miss Marple reflected on her brief but careful observations at the vicarage. The choir mistress's discomfort was not physical. It was lodged in her mind and perhaps, more importantly, in the minds of those around her. Each villager, Miss Marple knew, carried a mask. Beneath it lay fears, grudges, and desires that, if left unchecked, could erupt in ways that threatened more than just Sunday services. By mid-morning, Miss Marple set out for St. Mary's Church. The spring air was crisp, scented faintly with damp earth and new growth. She arrived just as the first choir rehearsal of the week was concluding, and the churchyard was alive with the murmur of voices. The congregation and villagers gathered outside were discussing Prudence in low, anxious tones. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. She had always found that when people spoke in hushed whispers, the truth was often hidden in the very words they dared not speak aloud. Miss Marple's first point of observation was Reverend Benedict Hawthorne. The vicar had always been a man of fastidious manners and polite speech, yet there was a tension in the set of his shoulders that suggested worry or perhaps guilt. He greeted her with a polite nod and a slightly nervous smile. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, "I trust you slept well." "We are all most perplexed, I assure you." "Indeed, Reverend," said Miss Marple, choosing her words carefully. "It is, after all, a curious situation when a woman of such habitual precision as Miss Hargrove can suddenly cease to sing. May I ask how she has spent the morning?" The vicar sighed, glancing toward the church porch where Prudence now lingered, her head bowed. She attended the rehearsal as usual, directing the choir with her usual meticulousness. But she spoke little, and, well, she did not sing. Some of the choristers are growing anxious. They are accustomed to her voice guiding them. Miss Marple nodded. She had anticipated as much. Choirs, like any group that depends on a leader, quickly sense disruption. But it was not merely the musical aspect that concerned her. It was the emotional and psychological. A woman so devoted to her craft, silenced without physical cause, suggested a disturbance in the social or emotional landscape of the village. Turning her attention to other villagers, Miss Marple observed Miss Eliza Thorne, the vicarage housekeeper. Miss Thorne's eyes flickered toward Prudence, then quickly away, betraying a mixture of concern and something less easily named. Miss Marple had long noted that the village housekeepers often carried more information than they revealed. Their positions afforded them a quiet omniscience. If anyone knew hidden tensions, Miss Thorne was likely to be a repository of knowledge, even if unwilling to speak it outright. Determined to gather more details, Miss Marple decided to pay visits to several key figures in the village, beginning with the Fennel family, whose manor overlooked the churchyard. Lord Charles Fennel was a man of austere demeanor and a sharp eye, while his sister, Lady Henrietta, had a reputation for delicate charm and curiosity bordering on meddlesome. Both had ties to the church choir, Lord Charles as a patron, Lady Henrietta as an enthusiastic participant. When Miss Marple arrived, the house was bright with the scent of spring flowers carefully arranged in vases along the hallway. Miss Marple, how delightful to see you," Lady Henrietta exclaimed, appearing at the top of the staircase. Her voice was light, but her eyes were quick, darting to her brother who was reviewing documents in the library. "Law want to know we are quite troubled by Miss Hargrove's predicament. It is most unsettling for the village." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Indeed, Lady Henrietta. And have either of you observed anything unusual in her behavior recently? Any signs of distress, quarrels, or misunderstandings that might account for this sudden silence?" Lord Charles looked up, his brow furrowed. "Not that I can discern. Prudence is a capable woman, perhaps a temporary shock. She tripped, yes, but she is otherwise robust. I cannot imagine any reason for her refusal to sing." Miss Marple, however, had already begun to notice subtle inconsistencies. While Lord Charles spoke with confidence, his fingers twitched ever so slightly as he laid papers aside. A minor sign, but, to Miss Marple, an indicator that he may be concealing more than he intended. Lady Henrietta, meanwhile, seemed unusually attentive to the details of Prudence's fall, almost as though she were seeking reassurance rather than providing information. Over the next several days, Miss Marple methodically interviewed additional villagers. Among them was Mr. Philip Crowley, a retired schoolmaster who had recently joined the choir for companionship. He spoke with measured politeness, but Miss Marple detected the faintest edge of irritation whenever Prudence's name was mentioned. Miss Crowley, she concluded, may have harbored resentment at the authority Prudence wielded. Then there was Mrs. Beatrice Langley, a widowed neighbor whose admiration for Prudence was tempered by a subtle envy. She praised the choir mistress effusively, yet her glances were not without calculation, as though she were measuring her own status against that of the silenced woman. Miss Marple's observations extended beyond conversation. She noted the behavior of the choir itself. Rehearsals proceeded, but a peculiar tension had settled over the group. Choristers glanced nervously toward Prudence, who directed with precision but remained strangely detached. There were whispered comments, half smiles, and fleeting exchanges that revealed alliances, rivalries, and concealed dissatisfaction. Even the parish organist, Mr. Lawrence Finch, usually a model of professional courtesy, exhibited a faint impatience. He tapped his foot with a rhythm that did not belong to the music, and Miss Marple suspected he was frustrated by Prudence's silence, or perhaps by something else entirely. A breakthrough came unexpectedly one afternoon when Miss Marple accompanied the young choristers on their walk home. Two of the girls, chatting nervously, let slip a detail that none of the adults had thought to mention. She won't sing, Miss Marple," said one, her voice barely above a whisper. Barely above a whisper. She says she heard something last week. Something she can't forget. Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. "Heard something, you say? And what was that, dear?" The girls exchanged uncertain glances. She didn't say," admitted the other, "but she cried. Quietly, in the vestry. We were told not to speak of it." This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion that Prudence's silence was rooted in something psychological, something tied to a secret or shocking revelation. It was not merely an accident, nor an illness. It was an event that had unsettled her profoundly. Miss Marple next sought the counsel of Dr. Altham, the village physician. His small surgery smelled faintly of antiseptic and herbs, and the doctor himself was a man of gentle demeanor who treated each patient as though they were a delicate instrument. Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head, "I have examined her thoroughly. There is no physical cause for her inability or refusal to sing. I can offer no medical explanation. It is psychological, as you might say." "A psychological, yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Yet it must have a cause, doctor, a reason rooted in experience and observation in the affairs of her life. Might I ask whether she mentioned anything that distressed her recently? Any argument, any quarrel, any unpleasant surprise?" Dr. Altham frowned. She has been tight-lipped. Only once did she mention a shock, and even then she would not elaborate. "I fear, Miss Marple, that the mind sometimes bears burdens that the body cannot. But the village is unsettled, and without her voice the choir is diminished. I cannot help but worry that she will remain silent indefinitely." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the subtle signs she had noted in the villagers' behavior. The furtive glances, the half-concealed smiles, the brief hesitation before speaking about Prudence. Clearly, someone had knowledge of the event that had silenced her. She did not yet know who or why, but she had gathered sufficient threads to begin forming a pattern. Her investigation continued with methodical care. She visited the post office, where the postmistress, Mrs. Constance Milligan, mentioned deliveries of unusual letters addressed to Prudence in the weeks preceding the fall. Packages of sheet music, anonymous notes, and even a small, unmarked bottle had arrived. While none seemed overtly threatening, the accumulation of these items suggested that someone had been attempting to influence or perhaps intimidate the choir mistress. By the end of the week, Miss Marple had compiled a mental catalog of suspects. Reverend Hawthorne, whose calm exterior might conceal anxiety or culpability. Mrs. Thorne, who knew more than she admitted. Lord Charles and Lady Henrietta, whose connections to the choir provided opportunity. Mr. Crowley, whose quiet resentment might mask deeper motives. And Mrs. Langley, whose envy could inspire action she would not openly confess. Each carried potential motives, though their guilt or innocence remained undetermined. The turning point came one evening as Miss Marple strolled past the churchyard at twilight. The air was heavy with the scent of lilacs, and the bells told a solemn, measured cadence. She observed Prudence Hargrove through the stained-glass window, her figure small and rigid as she sat alone in the choir stalls. A soft movement caught Miss Marple's eye, a shadow passing across the vestry door, a slight figure bending to speak with the silenced mistress. "Ah!" Miss Marple noted the furtive gestures and the nervous glance exchanged. Here, at last, was a clue. An interaction, brief and seemingly innocuous, that suggested an outside influence. Perhaps a secret being delivered or a threat made. Miss Marple's mind, as always, worked quietly, threading together these disparate observations. The village was no longer merely a setting for a curious accident. It was the stage for a subtle drama of hidden motives, veiled resentments, and silent manipulation. Every villager's action, every gesture, every shadowed glance might hold the key to understanding Prudence Hargrove's sudden and unnatural silence. And so, with patience as her ally, Miss Marple resolved to watch, to listen, and to wait. For in Little Phenol, she knew, the truth was never obvious at first glance. It whispered in shadows, hid in polite smiles, and waited for the careful observer to discern it. Miss Marple had begun to see that shape already, and she felt a quiet certainty that the puzzle would soon yield its secrets. The week that followed Miss Marple's careful observations was one of subtle unease in Little Phenol. The village itself seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that something hidden had begun to surface. Even the high street, usually alive with chatter and the daily bustle of tradespeople, carried a quieter air, punctuated by furtive glances and the occasional sharp whisper. Miss Marple, with her keen eye and quiet patience, noted everything. The village was like a puzzle, each resident a piece that, when correctly aligned, would reveal the truth behind Prudence Hargrove's enforced silence. It was during one of her routine walks that Miss Marple first noticed a curious change in the behavior of Mrs. Beatrice Langley. Usually demure and polite, Mrs. Langley now lingered near the churchyard, ostensibly to admire the early blossoms, but in reality, Miss Marple suspected to observe Prudence. Her eyes darted nervously whenever anyone approached the vestry, and she muttered half-formed comments to herself, which the keen observer could only assume were rehearsals of what she might say, or accusations she feared to voice aloud. Such behavior suggested an inner turmoil, perhaps envy or possibly guilt. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire more closely into Mrs. Langley's connection with the choir mistress. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate regarding a mysterious visitor seen near the church in the evenings. A tall man, often clad in a dark overcoat, had been spotted lingering near the hedgerows or speaking in low tones with certain villagers. Miss Marple paid careful attention to these reports, questioning the postmistress and the milkman, both of whom claimed to have noticed the stranger. "He seems to appear and vanish without purpose," the postmistress said, wringing her hands. "But he's been seen with Mr. Crowley on 2 occasions and with Miss Thorne once. It's most peculiar." This revelation added another layer to the unfolding puzzle. Miss Marple considered the potential connections. Mr. Crowley, already showing subtle signs of resentment toward Prudence, now appeared in the company of an unidentified individual. Mrs. Thorne, always reticent with information, had been seen with the same stranger. Such coincidences, she knew, were rarely accidental. There was a thread connecting the villagers, Prudence's sudden silence, and this mysterious visitor, and Miss Marple intended to follow it to its source. Her next step was to speak directly with Prudence herself. The choir mistress had grown slightly more communicative over the past few days, though her voice remained unused. Miss Marple approached her one afternoon in the vestry, where the sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the floor in hues of amber and rose. Prudence sat stiffly in her chair, eyes cast downward. "Prudence," Miss Marple began softly, "I understand that you have been troubled, but I wonder if there is something you can tell me. Even a small clue, a word or a gesture could help me understand." Prudence's hands trembled slightly, and her eyes flicked toward the music stand, where a single sheet of notes lay untouched. I cannot," she whispered, voice barely audible. It's too shameful. I was warned." Miss Marple leaned closer, speaking with gentle encouragement. Warned? By whom, Prudence? Surely no one in Little Phenol would wish you harm." Prudence shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I cannot say, But if I speak, everything will be lost. My position, my respect, and perhaps worse, I was told to stop singing, or there would be consequences. Alice. Miss Marple's mind raced. There it was, the first clear indication that Prudence's silence was not accidental or psychological alone. Someone in the village had threatened her, and that threat carried sufficient weight to silence her completely. It was a revelation that cast a shadow over the seemingly serene village, and it required careful scrutiny to identify the culprit. To uncover the truth, Miss Marple began to piece together the recent interactions of the villagers. Lord Charles Feenall's patronage of the church choir, once assumed benign, now appeared to conceal subtle pressures. He had been present during several tense rehearsals, offering advice that bordered on admonition, and his eyes occasionally flickered toward Prudence with a sharpness that suggested more than simple interest in musical performance. Lady Henrietta, too, became a subject of scrutiny. Her charm, previously dismissed as mere frivolity, now seemed strategic. She lingered near Prudence under the guise of concern, yet her questions were pointed, probing, and designed to elicit fear rather than comfort. Then there was Mr. Toy, Philip Crowley, whose quiet resentment had grown more evident. Miss Marple observed him during choir practice, noting the subtle way he positioned himself near Prudence, the slight smirk he suppressed whenever she faltered, and the faint irritation in his eyes whenever she directed the choristers with her usual precision. Each observation, minor in isolation, became significant when considered alongside the other anomalies in the village's social landscape. Yet not all clues were straightforward. Miss Marple encountered red herrings that tested her discernment. The mysterious visitor, for instance, was eventually identified as a distant relative of Prudence's, come to settle a minor inheritance matter. His presence, though alarming to the villagers, was innocuous, illustrating how fear and rumor could distort perception. Similarly, minor quarrels between choristers, petty jealousies over solos and praise, and whispered criticisms of Prudence's style created the illusion of conspiracies that did not exist. Miss Marple, ever patient, catalogued these misleading elements carefully, distinguishing genuine danger from village chatter. One evening, a new clue emerged that shifted the investigation dramatically. Miss Marple received a note slipped under her door unsigned but written in a familiar, elegant hand. It read, "Look to the music room. The answer lies where she once sang freely." Intrigued, Miss Marple walked to the church that night, a lantern in hand. The nave was quiet, and the organ hummed faintly in the distance, a ghost of sound that reminded her of the choir's former vibrancy. In the music room, she found a discarded sheet of music partially hidden beneath a bench. The notes were ordinary, but a careful examination revealed an annotation in pencil, a name, faint and hurried, written at the bottom of the page. It was Mr. Lawrence Finch, the organist. Miss Marple noted the subtlety of the signature, the nervous scrawl, and the context in which it appeared. Was it a clue left inadvertently or a deliberate attempt to implicate or mislead? She filed the observation in her mind, recognizing that this piece, like all others, must be considered carefully before drawing conclusions. The next day, Miss Marple arranged a subtle test. During rehearsal, she engaged the choristers in conversation, posing gentle questions about their experiences, their observations of Prudence, and any unusual events they might have witnessed. A pattern began to emerge. While most choristers expressed concern for Prudence's well-being, several hinted at overheard conversations and mysterious deliveries. One young soprano, more observant than her years suggested, mentioned seeing Lady Henrietta slip a folded note into Prudence's music bag, a detail previously unnoticed. Miss Marple's mind wove together these threads. The threatening message, the note slipped into her own door, the nervous glances of villagers, the whispered confidences of choristers. It became increasingly clear that Prudence's silence was the result of deliberate intimidation, orchestrated by someone with access, opportunity, and motive. The challenge lay in distinguishing the actual threat from the web of red herrings and misdirection that pervaded the village. To test her theory, Miss Marple arranged a quiet afternoon visit to the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss parish matters. She watched Prudence closely, observing her interactions with various visitors. When Lady Henrietta arrived, ostensibly to offer comfort, Miss Marple noted the brief, tense exchange, A glance of warning from the choir mistress, a flinch barely perceptible, and the sudden withdrawal of Lady Henrietta after a perfunctory conversation. Here, Miss Marple thought, was confirmation. Someone had instilled fear, and that fear was powerful enough to silence a woman who had once commanded the attention of an entire congregation with her voice. By the end of Act 3, Miss Marple had assembled a complex map of motives, secrets, and misleading clues. Every villager she had observed possessed the potential for involvement, yet the true threat remained elusive. She recognized the importance of patience. Only careful observation and the judicious application of gentle pressure would reveal the culprit. In Little Phenol, appearances were deceptive, and the truth, like the melody of a long-forgotten hymn, required careful listening to discern. Miss Marple retired that evening to her cottage, the lantern by the window casting a warm glow over her tea and notebook. She reflected on the week's discoveries, each clue and red herring cataloged with meticulous care. The village, she realized, was a tapestry woven with fear, envy, and secret alliances. Prudence Hargrove's sudden silence had exposed the undercurrent of tension that lay beneath the veneer of polite civility. The solution, Miss Marple felt with quiet certainty, was within reach, but it would demand patience, subtlety, and an understanding of human nature that only a lifetime of observation could provide. And so the village settled into uneasy quiet once more, unaware that the pieces of the puzzle were slowly aligning. Miss Marple, however, watched with keen eyes, ready to see the hidden connections emerge. Somewhere in Little Phenol, the truth waited, and she was determined that no shadow, no whisper, and no subtle glance would remain unnoticed until the mystery was resolved. The morning air in Little Phenol carried a sense of calm that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar tweed coat and scarf, set out along the winding lanes with a notebook tucked under her arm, her mind a whirl of observations and deduction. She had spent the previous week collecting small, almost imperceptible details. Furtive glances, whispered conversations, nervous gestures, and now it was time to fit the pieces together. The village, which had seemed peaceful on first glance, revealed itself to her as a latticework of secrets, rivalries, and unspoken fear. And at the center of this web was Prudence Hargrove, silenced not by accident, nor by simple psychological strain, but by a deliberate act designed to intimidate and control. Miss Marple began her day with a careful review of her mental catalog of the villagers. Lord Charles Phenol had the influence and the opportunity, yet his outward anxiety seemed genuine rather than feigned. Lady Henrietta's charm had masked subtle manipulations, but Miss Marple had noted that her actions, though intrusive, were seldom direct. Mr. Philip Crowley, with his quiet resentment, appeared at first glance a likely suspect. However, Miss Marple recalled the absence of any direct interaction between him and Prudence that could account for the severity of her fear. Mrs. Beatrice Langley's envy had certainly contributed to the whispers and gossip, but envy alone was rarely sufficient to enforce such a profound and immediate response. Only a few possibilities remained, and within them, Miss Marple sensed the vital clue that would unlock the entire mystery. Her first stop was the vicarage, where she knew Prudence would be in attendance, tending to the choir's daily routines. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the polished floor. Prudence sat quietly in her high-backed chair, fingers intertwined in her lap, eyes cast downward as though gathering courage from the familiar surroundings. Miss Marple approached with gentle steps, careful not to startle her. "Oh, Prudence," she began softly, "I believe I am beginning to understand why you have remained silent. There are those among us who would see you subdued, controlled by fear rather than reason. But you need not carry this alone. You may trust me." Prudence's eyes lifted slightly, revealing a flicker of hope, but also continued hesitation. Miss Marple, patient as ever, allowed the silence to stretch, knowing that pressure often forced a truthful admission. At last, Prudence spoke, her voice trembling but coherent. It was Lady Henrietta. She left the notes. She said I must not sing, that the choir could not continue unless I obeyed her wishes. And the bottle she sent. Miss Marple's sharp mind pieced together the puzzle instantly. The bottle?" she prompted. Prudence nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. "The small vial of something, perhaps medicine. I was not to touch it," she said, "but the thread alone was enough. I could not bear to sing after that." Here was the critical breakthrough. The anonymous notes, the subtle warnings, and the orchestrated deliveries of objects designed to intimidate were all part of a calculated campaign. Miss Marple's understanding of human nature allowed her to see the patterns hidden in Lady Henrietta's actions, the charm that masked manipulation, the concern that concealed coercion, the proximity that allowed observation and intimidation without arousing suspicion. With Prudence's reluctant confession, Miss Marple moved to consolidate her findings. She carefully reviewed the interactions she had observed, the subtle flinch when Lady Henrietta approached, the nervous glance exchanged when certain notes were mentioned, and the unexplained tension in the vicarage whenever Lady Henrietta visited. Each action, minor in isolation, now coalesced into an unmistakable pattern of deliberate intimidation. Lady Henrietta had sought to control Prudence, to influence the choir's leadership, and to assert dominance under the guise of helpfulness. Her motives were a mixture of social ambition and personal pride, a desire to see the choir aligned with her own vision rather than Prudence's professional and disciplined direction. Miss Marple's next step was to test her deduction before confronting the perpetrator. She carefully arranged for a rehearsal with the choir under the pretext of observing their preparation for the upcoming spring fair. The church was bathed in the gentle light of late afternoon, and the choristers, aware of Miss Marple's presence, behaved with a mixture of enthusiasm and curiosity. Prudence, seated quietly at the side, seemed nervous yet attentive. Miss Marple positioned herself discreetly to observe Lady Henrietta, who had arrived unexpectedly, offering to assist with the rehearsal. As the session progressed, Miss Marple noted the familiar signs, the subtle, possessive glances, the brief tightening of Lady Henrietta's lips, and the occasional hand hovering near the folded sheet music, gestures that betrayed a desire to monitor and control rather than merely participate. Prudence's hand shook slightly, though she remained seated, and the choristers exchanged small, uneasy glances. Miss Marple, confident in her understanding of the dynamics, decided it was time to intervene. "Lady Henrietta," she said, her voice calm but firm, "might I have a word with you?" The woman looked up, feigning surprise, and followed Miss Marple to a quiet corner of the church. "I believe you have been exercising undue influence over Prudence Hargrove," Miss Marple continued. "Your actions, though perhaps intended as guidance, have caused fear sufficient to silence her voice entirely. Is that not so?" Lady Henrietta's composure faltered, if only for a moment. A subtle tension appeared across her face, and a flush of color betrayed her momentary loss of control. I meant no harm," she protested softly, though the hesitation in her tone betrayed the truth. Miss Marple, with the gentlest firmness, pressed further. "Threats, notes, and mysterious warnings are not the way to inspire excellence, Lady Henrietta. Prudence Hargrove's silence is a consequence of fear, and fear of this sort has no place in a community such as Little Phenol." The confrontation drew the attention of the choristers and vicar alike. Prudence, encouraged by Miss Marple's intervention, rose slowly from her chair, her voice tentative at first. I am not afraid to sing," she said, the words soft but unmistakable. Miss Marple smiled, noting the relief that began to spread through the room. Lady Henrietta, confronted by the tangible consequences of her actions, lowered her eyes, a mix of shame and exasperation settling over her features. With Prudence's confidence gradually returning, Miss Marple addressed the assembled villagers. She spoke not with accusation alone, but with clarity and reason, outlining the pattern of intimidation, the subtle manipulations, and the observations that had led her to understand the situation fully. She emphasized the importance of honesty, respect, and the perils of allowing ambition to override compassion. By the time she finished, the tension in the church had eased somewhat, though Lady Henrietta's discomfort remained evident, a natural response to recognition of her misdeeds. In the following days, Miss Marple ensured that Prudence was supported and reassured, her return to the choir facilitated gently and thoughtfully. She encouraged the vicar to maintain a watchful yet considerate eye on interactions within the parish to prevent similar manipulations in the future. The village began to breathe again, the subtle undercurrent of fear replaced by a cautious optimism. Miss Marple, ever reflective, spent long evenings in her cottage reviewing the events, the behaviors, and the motives that had brought the situation to a crisis. She noted how envy, ambition, and pride, when combined with opportunity, could quietly manipulate and control even the most steadfast individuals. She considered the courage required to confront such manipulations and the importance of careful observation in discerning truth from deception. In Little Phenol, she thought, even the smallest gesture, a note left under a door, a glance exchanged in secret, could carry consequences far greater than the actors intended. By the end of Act Vier, the stage was set for the final resolution. Miss Marple had identified the source of Prudence's silence, understood the motives and methods behind it, and prepared to restore equilibrium to the village. The clues, red herrings, and subtle signals had all converged into a coherent pattern, one that allowed justice, not through punishment, but through understanding and restoration, to prevail. Little Phenol, poised on the brink of revelation, awaited the final act where the delicate balance of human emotions, clever observation, and gentle persuasion would bring the story to a satisfying conclusion. The morning following Miss Marple's subtle but decisive confrontation, Little Phenol awoke to a lightness that had been absent for weeks. The church bells rang clear and cheerful, no longer weighed down by the tension of Prudence Hargrove's silence. Villagers went about their routines with measured optimism, aware, perhaps subconsciously, that the shadow that had hung over the choir and the parish was lifting. Miss Marple, walking along the high street with her basket in hand, observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. Even the children, who had grown accustomed to whispers and half-stifled curiosity, skipped along the cobbles with unguarded laughter. The village was, once again, a community in which secrets, though persistent, were balanced by honesty and human kindness. Miss Marple's first visit was naturally to the vicarage, where she found Prudence seated at a small table in the sunlit kitchen, a cup of tea before her, and music sheets spread in an orderly fashion. The choir mistress looked smaller somehow, not in stature but in the careful suppression of tension that had held her upright for so long. Today, however, she was at ease. The tightness around her eyes softened, and her fingers twitched with anticipation, as if they itched to return to their accustomed activity. Miss Marple approached quietly, settling in the chair opposite her with her customary air of calm authority. Prudence," she said gently, "I trust you slept well, and that you feel ready to reclaim the place that belongs to you?" Prudence's eyes met hers, steady now with a hint of gratitude. "I do," she replied, her voice still soft but clear. "I am ready to sing again." "Thank you, Miss Marple. You saw what no one else could." Miss Marple smiled faintly, a subtle expression of satisfaction rather than triumph. "I only observed, dear. People are often more revealing than they think, and when fear is removed, the truth can finally emerge." The vicar, Reverend Hawthorne, entered the kitchen at that moment, his clerical collar immaculate, yet his expression relaxed. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said warmly, "it seems Little Phenol owes you yet another debt of gratitude. Prudence, are you truly—" I am," Prudence interrupted, a small smile curving her lips. "I shall return to the choir today. We will rehearse for the fair, and I shall sing once more." The words, so simple yet so full of quiet triumph, seemed to lift the room itself. Later that afternoon, the villagers gathered in the church for a special rehearsal, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the back, observed the room with her customary patience. The choristers, young and old alike, whispered excitedly, exchanging glances that suggested they, too, felt the tension ebbing. Prudence stepped to the front, music in hand, and the first tentative notes of a familiar hymn filled the air. Her voice was soft at first, but it gained strength and clarity with each measure, flowing confidently through the nave, echoing against the stained glass windows. The congregation and choir alike held their breath in admiration. Lady Henrietta entered shortly afterward, hoping perhaps to oversee the rehearsal, but Miss Marple noticed immediately the subtle change in her demeanor. No longer was she controlling or coercive. She seemed smaller somehow, as if the revelation of her actions had tempered her ambition. When Prudence's voice rang clear, Lady Henrietta's lips pressed together, her expression a mixture of remorse and resignation. Miss Marple had observed enough over the past weeks to know that the woman's influence had been tempered, not through confrontation alone, but through the careful exposure of truth. After the rehearsal, Miss Marple gathered the key villagers, Lady Henrietta, Lord Charles Phenol, Mrs. Thorne, and Mr. Crowley, for a discreet conversation in the church parlor. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and spring flowers, and the late afternoon light streamed through the windows, softening the edges of what might have been a tense encounter. "A Lady Henrietta," Miss Marple began calmly, "your actions over the past weeks have caused unnecessary fear for Prudence Hargrove. I do not speak to accuse, but to clarify. Fear, when wielded as a tool, is cruel. You may have thought yourself acting in the choir's interest, but the method was mistaken." Lady Henrietta lowered her gaze, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. I see that now," she admitted quietly. "I only wish the choir to reach its potential. I did not intend to harm her." "Intent matters less than effect," Miss Marple replied gently, "and the effect here was fear. Prudence's talent and dignity were compromised. Let this serve as a lesson. Influence must never override respect." Lord Charles, Mr. Crowley, and Mrs. Thorne listened in silence, each reflecting on their own minor contributions to the tension. Miss Marple had observed their behaviors, the subtle encouragement of Lady Henrietta's manipulations by some, the quiet resentment or gossip by others, and she allowed them a moment to recognize their part without direct accusation. Human nature, she reflected, was rarely pure or simple. Even small acts of envy or pride could ripple into consequences far greater than intended. With the formal conversation concluded, Miss Marple allowed the group to return to their duties, confident that the balance had been restored. Prudence's voice was once more central to the choir, the subtle threats and manipulations removed, and the village free to return to its gentle rhythms. The upcoming fair would benefit not only from the choir's renewed vigor, but from the restored harmony among the villagers themselves. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the soft glow of lantern light guiding her through the quiet lanes. She paused by the window to observe the village, noting the subtle changes, the lighter step of the postwoman, the cheerful greetings of children returning from play, the calm of the churchyard now free from whispered anxiety. Little Phenol, she reflected, had returned to a state of equilibrium, though she knew well that human nature would continue to produce the occasional ripple. It was her role, and the role of those who observed carefully, to recognize and gently correct such disturbances before they escalated. Sitting with her tea and notebook, Miss Marple reflected on the mystery in its entirety. Prudence Hargrove had been silenced not by accident or illness, but by fear. Fear induced by subtle manipulation and ambition cloaked in charm. The notes, the whispered threats, and the carefully placed objects had all contributed to a climate of intimidation. Yet, through patience, observation, and gentle confrontation, the truth had been revealed, and the community's natural equilibrium restored. It was, Miss Marple mused, a testament to the quiet power of insight over force. In the following days, the choir resumed its regular rehearsals, Prudence's voice once again leading the group with authority and grace. The villagers, having witnessed the resolution of the crisis, spoke more openly of their respect for Miss Marple and her subtle wisdom. Lady Henrietta, chastened but not humiliated, engaged in the choir with renewed humility, while Mr. Crowley and Mrs. Thorne adjusted their interactions with prudence, mindful of the lesson learned. The spring fair arrived in full bloom, the church filled with music, laughter, and the gentle murmur of human connection restored. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the back of the nave during the fete, allowed herself a small, private smile. She had observed, questioned, and guided events with patience and tact. In the end, the mystery had been solved not through confrontation alone, but through understanding, empathy, and the careful discernment of human behavior. Prudence Hargrove, the choir mistress who had been silenced, now sang again, not just with her voice, but with the confidence of one who had regained her rightful place in the community. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village, Miss Marple reflected on the simple yet profound truth that lay at the heart of the mystery. People, in all their complexity, could act out of fear, envy, or ambition, but with careful observation and gentle wisdom, even the most intricate of human puzzles could be unraveled. Little Phenol, restored to its gentle rhythms, would never forget the lessons of the past weeks, and neither would its residents forget the quiet, penetrating insight of the village's most perceptive observer. And so, in the calm of her cottage that evening, Miss Marple poured herself a final cup of tea, settled into her favorite chair, and allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, a community restored, and a voice regained. Outside, the village slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, the church bells having ceased their anxious tolls, and the gentle hum of life resuming its natural course. The mystery of the choir mistress who had never sung again was resolved not with force, but with observation, empathy, and the quiet intelligence of one who understood human nature in all its subtlety. Little Phenol could rest easy, and Miss Marple, as ever, prepared for the next puzzle, confident that the delicate balance of truth and understanding had once again been restored.